This is Colin Brown from Woodburn Rising. Today is January the 15th, 2014. I buried one of my friends today, Mr. Robert Lincoln Hurst, who died at the age of 93 last January the 7th. Bob Hurst was one of the grand folk of Woodburn, who was a passionate, exciting, and friendly man who loved everybody he knew.
Hello, I'm Bob Hurst. I'm sitting here in front of the Jake Miller house. It also was the house where my mother last lived. I was born in the ox barn in 1920. My mother was born there in 1984. But during the early 30s and through the 30s, I spent nights with my grandma, who lived up on Main Street. And she was alone, so I stayed nights with her. During those days, there wasn't much to do in the evening, so I spent quite a bit of time talking to her. She told me quite a bit about the Aurora colony, coming across the plains in the covered wagons, and most of the information that I now have in my head all comes from her. I enjoyed very much staying with my grandma, and although she had lots of hardships in her life, she was a very cheerful lady that lived till she was 99 years old. Her maiden name was Miller. Her married name was Will. I don't know the year Fred Will and Henrietta Miller, who was my grandma, got married, but it was right around 1875, I think. Might have been a little bit before that. My grandmother lived in the ox barn where she and her husband had a store. It was called the Fred Will Mercantile, and that is the building why my mother was born there. Later they gave the building to my mother, as my father had a drayage business, hauling from the depot and delivering the goods around town. And my grandfather thought he needed that building to store his stuff in, and my grandfather had sold the store, and it was not being in use. So it made a pretty good place for my father also. Now, getting back to my grandma again, she told me in coming across the plains, they walked most of the way. Her father was a very nice person and had feeling for his children, so he let the kids take a few minutes every day to drive the wagon so they could walk. And also she told me that before they left Bethel, Missouri, they made lots of noodles, and they put them in a flour sack, and the noodles were tied on the outside of the wagon. Noodles were light and could be stored outside because the flour sacks kept the dust off of them. Then when they came to a water hole, they could make noodle soup real easy, and yet it had the nourishment in it of the eggs and the other things, and it provided them pretty well coming across the plains. She also told me that it was really a treat when they happened to get a deer or some game, because that was the only meat they had in coming across. I don't know exactly how, I don't know just exactly how long it took them to come across, but she related one incident where they stopped in a place in Wyoming called Muddy Gap, because it had rained hard there, and they had to stay there a couple days. I've heard people tell that lived in Wyoming that they saw the carvings on the rocks, where that happened quite often in Wyoming. One other incident they had when they were coming across the plains, my mother's sister was bitten by a rattlesnake. And I asked my grandma, I said, well, what did they do for her? She said they just filled her up with whiskey and it pulled her through. But we know now that that's a very poor thing to do, because it circulates your blood through the veins faster, and it would be very dangerous to do to someone bitten by a poisonous insect or snake. Now, getting back to the Aurora colony, Dr. Kyle, of course, as we all know, was the ruler of the colony, and a very good one too, because it took a strong man to hold things together, such as he did. And he divided things up pretty well and had every person doing what they could do best, which was one of his the attributes to a successful colony. But when the colony broke up, I don't know how my grandfather got the ox barn, but anyway, he received it some way, and he made it into a store by putting a floor in it and putting an upstairs in it where they had bedrooms, and downstairs there was a living room and a kitchen. It worked very well for them, and they seemed to get along pretty well there. And my family got along well there later also. Excuse me, can we stop? One very interesting thing about the Aurora colony was when they were about 2 weeks from leaving Bethel, Missouri to come west, Willie Kyle died. Willie Kyle was Dr. Kyle's 19-year-old son. Well, Dr. Kyle says Willie's going to come along with us. So he had his metalsmiths make a tank out of copper, and they put Willie in that tank and filled it with alcohol. So you might say they brought Willie out here pickled. But their scouts had him pegged to go to Willapa, Washington, which is a few miles out of Raymond, Washington. And if you be traveling from Raymond, Washington towards Longview, Washington, right today you'll see a big highway sign that says, Willie Kyle is buried here. They never brought Willie back to Aurora. He stayed in Washington. But they said that bringing him out here, the Indians were very, very friendly with them, as Willie led the wagon train pulled by mules. In fact, all of the wagons were pulled by mules in this train. And when they got out here, when we talk about the ox barn where the museum is now, we think, well, why did they need an ox barn when they came out by mules? But they used the oxen for logging, and it was all timbered very heavily around here. And there was a sawmill in Aurora, and they used the oxen for that. And I don't think they ever had a lot of oxen. If I remember right, I think about 12 oxen was as many as they ever had at one time. The importance of the oxen was that they seemed to be better for pulling the logs than horses. I guess oxen are a little bit stronger, and they lift their load rather than to pull it like a horse does, because of the yoke going over their neck. As they forge forward, it kind of is a lifting action instead of a pulling action. Now today I'm down here being asked to talk a little bit about Aurora. So I want to talk a little bit about how Aurora was when I was a child. I thought it was the best place in the world to grow up. Everybody was very friendly, and at that time the Depression was on, so everybody was quite poor. Actually, we weren't so poor because we all had each other, and we all had enough to eat, but we didn't have money to spend for other things. And we had a great time picking berries. We didn't always like the picking berries, but it brought a few dollars in our pocket. And this time of the year, it was always hop picking, the last thing to do before we went to school. And although we didn't make much money, things didn't cost much. I remember when I was going to high school, I bought my clothes I needed for the year, and my sister was with me, and I had about $10 left over. And I noticed a very pretty twin sweater set, a sleeveless sweater, and then a long sleeve sweater to go over it. And I said to my sister, "Oh, that is so pretty. I sure wish that I could buy it." And she says, well, why don't you go ahead and buy it? I says, well, what will Mother say? And she says, well, it's your money. So I bought it, and it cost $7. And I thought it was about the most pretty thing I ever had, and I wore it to high school all year. But after us kids had picked berries on the hot days in the afternoon, we'd all go down to Pudding River to swim. And it was a very, very good place to swim. There was 2 diving boards there, one from about 10 feet high and the other about 4 feet high. And we enjoyed it very much. There was also a sandy beach across the river, and when we'd get tired of swimming and diving, we would go over and lay down on that sandy beach. We thought that was just about the best thing there was in the world, and my parents would want me to go with them on a Sunday. I never wanted to do it. I just wanted to go down to that old swimming hole and swim. I think now Lois Manick, whose name is Lois Black now, and George Krause, and myself, and Richard Hill, who lives in Portland, are about the only ones left that I can think of. Oh yes, Karma Ottaway, and her name is Karma Cook. She swam down here, and her brother Hollis. And I think it might be that we're just about the last ones alive that swam down there in the summertime. But there used to be a lot of us. Now the old town was a good old town. On Main Street, we had Will Snyder's store, which was a very nice store. They had general merchandise as well as food. Right next to that was the Albert Ellen Barber Shop. And as I remember as a kid, I always got my hair cut for a quarter. And then next down from that, when I was very young, was the First National Bank. And then next to that was a confectionery store. And next to that, a drugstore, then a shoe shop, and then the bank building that is still there now, the Stone Building on the corner. I think now, of course, it is a antique shop. On the other side of the street, right close to the railroad track, was the post office. Up from that was a confectionery store, and also they had rooms to rent, and it was a place to eat dinner also. And then next to that was Walter Fry's house, then George Fry's house. And the Fry family, only one of them married. There was Tilly Fry, Andy Fry, George Fry, and Walter Fry. And Walter was the only one that got married. And he married a school teacher here in Aurora. And she had 2 boys, Albert and Glenn Foster. And they both were very good friends of mine, but they were all a few years older, and they're both gone now. Then right next to there is the building that's still there now, and it is called the, I think they call it, what's the name of the antique shop, Colin, up here on the corner? The big one, tall building.
Mercantile?
Mercantile?
Is that the one?
That's the one, I think. Anyway, that was a feed store when I was real little, and then later it became the office of the Portland General Electric Company. And all of the Portland General Electric crew worked out of this office here in Aurora. That was before they moved to Woodburn. Then next to that was a house where the manager, Melvin Evans, lived there, the manager of the Portland General Electric. And right next to he was the Dr. Giesey's house and his office. Dr. Giesey had 3 children. B. Forrest Giesey, that was his son, and next was his daughter Lotus Giesey, and then Maxine Giesey. And Maxine is still living in Portland. Next to them was a house known as the Giesey House, a relative of Dr. Giesey. And then next to that was a house that people by the name of Dams had, and we always knew it as the Dam House. And then was the Stoner's Garage, and then across the street from Stoner's Garage was the Aurora Observer building and office, and the American Legion building is there now. Right next to that was the undertaking builder, and which just burned down a few weeks ago. It burned down, however, as an antique store. And that's just about the way the downtown was then. Oh, pardon me, right where the vacant lot is today, catty corner across from the Legion building, was Krause's store, another very good store in this town. It was a tall cement building, 2-story, and they too had general merchandise as well as groceries. And so Aurora was a candy place at that time, and everybody seemed to get along very well. During the Depression, everyone looked out for each other, and until just before the war started, there wasn't anybody on welfare in this town. Although at that time they didn't call it welfare, they called it relief. And I've always felt pretty proud of that fact. Hi again. This is Bob again. One of the things that scared me silly when I was a young fella, there was a boy by the name of Delbert Hill. He was Richard Hill's brother, and he was a year younger than I am. But he and I were hunting with our .22 rifles down on the Pudding River. And we were both at that time I was probably about 13, he was about 12 years old. And we were actually looking for ducks, but we didn't find any ducks. So, of course, you know how young lads are. They want to shoot something. So we saw a bag in the river. And Delbert said to me, "I'll bet you can't hit that bag." And it was probably about 50 yards away. And I said, "Well, I can hit that easy." So I shot at it. And I hit it. And then Delbert shot at it. He hit it. And so we walked over. It was right in the bend of the river where there was a kind of eddy holding it close to the shore. And after we got over there, we found out that it was a man. By this time now, we're scared to death. So we run all the way to Pudding River, right up here, and Lewis Weber, who lived up at the corner just a little bit south of the Presbyterian Church, he was the notary public in the city here. So we thought of going to Louis' place. So we did, went up there, and he advised us to go down to see if there was a policeman in town. State police used to stop at the telephone office. The boys that would come up from, policemen that would come up from Milwaukee, Oregon, and from Salem, that was their turnaround, and they'd always check in there. Well, it just happened there was a policeman there, so we rode with him in the police car down on the Pudding River, and he looked at it, and he says, "You boys wait here." And he says, "I'm going to go call the coroner." And the coroner came down, and we thought he'd never get there. And as it was in November and it got dark earlier in the evening, it got dark. And while we were there, we were really scared and had ideas in our head about what if somebody murdered this man and threw him in the river, and now there might be after us. And we made ourselves really afraid. But the coroner finally got there, and they got him out of the river, and we were very happy, although scared, since we shot at him twice. And he said, "Well, it looks like he's been in the water about 3 weeks." Well, that made us very happy. The name of the man was Cadus Pratt, and he lived out on Meridian Road, which is close to the Pudding River. And evidently he wanted to commit suicide, so he put rocks in his pockets and jumped in the river and drowned himself. But as later on he came to the top, and he came to rest right there in that eddy in our old swimming hole. And we were very, very fortunate that there wasn't anything said about the bullet holes in him, but maybe his body was so decayed that they couldn't tell it. I'm not sure about that. Another thing that was quite an event, and there's only one boy left to verify my story, and that was when Dr. Giesey's wife died. They closed up the town for her funeral, and the drugstore closed up, but they left the back door open, as they lived in the back end of the drugstore. That was Manick's drugstore. And Eugene Manick, he was still in grade school, and I came home on the bus, and Lewis Hill, a brother to Delbert Hill, was standing catty-corner across the street from the ox barn, and I was living in the ox barn, so I was coming home, and he started passing the football to me. And as I walked down the street, we'd pass the football to each other. Well, here come Eugene hollering, and a man in front of him running right past where the lodge hall is now. It was known as the Tin Building then. And he's running as fast as he come right down the street, right down the sidewalk from where they were filming this. And Eugene hollering, "Stop that man, he just robbed our drugstore." And so I said, "Well, I'm going to stop at my house and get my gun." But my folks were at the funeral and the door was locked, so I couldn't take time to go in the house and get my gun. So Lewis and I put some big rocks in our pocket, and Eugene too, and he went down into the Pudding River bottom. Well, us kids, we knew every inch of that territory real well, and so we were gaining on him all the time. But he got down by the bridge, and Fane Sayer, who is the other one besides me that's living today to verify this story, he hollered at me and he said, "Bob, what should I do?" And he was on the highway. So I says, "Get some rocks and get out on the bridge to see if he's trying to swim the river." And Fane did, and he was trying to swim the river, and Fane threw a rock down on him and it hit him right in the head. Him under. So he came back to shore. We followed him down. He was on the edge of the river down by the railroad track. Crawled up on the railroad track, and there was a great big wild blackberry vine there, probably 50 feet across. And people had put boards and ladders and stuff up to pick the blackberries, and he thought it was a trail through those blackberries. So he went in there, and us kids stood there on the railroad track throwing those big jagged railroad rocks into there. And then Clarence Bostock, who lived right on the corner of the highway by the bridge, the house is still there, a policeman come along and he stopped him. And he drove as far as he could down towards the railroad track, and then he got out of his car and walked up where us, the three boys and myself was, and he hollered at the man and he says, "Come out of there." And he says, "I can't get out." And the policeman said, "Well, you got in there." So he says, "Yeah, but," he says, "I'm all stuck so bad I can't get out." And the policeman says, "You come out or I'm going to start shooting." So he did come out, and the poor guy, where Fane had hit him on the head with that rock, was bleeding and being, from all the blackberry spines sticking into him, he was really in bad shape, and they took him to jail. Well, the funny part of the story was that he had just got out of the prison in Salem, and he came down here, and he saw everybody, all the businesses closed up in town, and he saw Eugene go in the back of the drugstore. So he went in through that and went into the front of the drugstore and took all the money out of the cash register. But Eugene heard somebody there thinking it was folks. He come out, and there it was this fella, and he pushed Eugene to one side and run out the door, and that's how the chase started. Well, anyway, us kids thought we'd done a pretty good job by helping capture him. And the next morning in the paper, we couldn't wait in the Oregonian to see what it said. And it said, "Officer so-and-so captures parolee that just robbed the drugstore at Aurora." And it didn't mention any of us kids at all, so we thought they kind of gypped us there. There were some of the townspeople didn't like it either, and probably were a few letters written to the Oregonian. but it was quite a wild chase. And Fane, if you see this, maybe you can stop in someday and tell Colin that you were in on the chase. I'm trying to think of a few more incidents that happened. The old grade school up on the hill, just northwest of town, was about a half a mile walk in the morning for most of us kids, and we didn't mind it at all because it was a 4-room schoolhouse, about 100 kids in it, and we took kids in from that were out on the Willamette River by where now is Charbonneau, and then up the river towards Butteville. And they contracted with Aurora for their children to go to school there. They were in the Union Hill School District. And there was lots of fine kids went to school here, and I enjoyed every one of them. And now, 17 years ago, my sisters and I tried to get an old Aurora grade school picnic started, which we were able to do. Lucille Krause and John Krause and Robert Kyle helped us to get it going, and it's been going ever since. However, the first old grade school meeting we had, or picnic I should say, we had over 200 people there. And this last July, this event always occurs on the last Saturday of July. And the last Saturday of July this year, we had just 35 there. But they all voted to keep it going. So all of you that I have your address of will be getting notice of me next June about the picnic. And remember, it's always on the last Saturday of July. Hi, this is Bob Hurst again. I wanted to relate a little bit to you how this town stood up in World War II, being a German community, and at that time we were still called Dutchtown. I think we did real well. Just about everybody at first went to work in the shipyards and defense plants all over the country. We had buses that went from Salem to Portland. Some people boarded them here, and they went by shifts. All the shipyards worked 3 shifts a day, and ladies and men all went on the bus to the shipyard, all those that didn't drive. Now, I know most of the boys at that time, or a lot of the boys, joined the service right away. However, I didn't. I was kind of a slacker. And I had a little business in this town at that time, and so I didn't join the service right away. But later I did, and I joined the Seabees and was shipped overseas. And my good friend Lewis Hill, who was in the Navy also, he was a gunner on a Douglas dive bomber, or a torpedo bomber, pardon me. And Lewis was on a ship that went down. The torpedo bomber was based on an aircraft carrier, and he lost his life on the second time the ship was shot down. And I don't think Lewis's body was ever found. But Lewis was a fine young man, and I just feel privileged that I was acquainted with him. And but Aurora did stand up real good during that time. Of course, the farmers were kept busy farming, and there wasn't too many young men in town at that time because all the young men were joining different branches of the service. But it was a very, very happy time when the war was over and everybody came home. That, if you'll remember, the war was over in Germany, I believe it was in April of 1945. And then the war in Japan was over in the latter part of August, but I don't think the treaty was signed until September. I happened to be on Okinawa at that time, and I saw the white airplane coming in to Okinawa where the preliminary treaty was signed. I was lucky enough to get home. I got to Seattle on Christmas Eve of 1945. And at that time, there was all kinds of signs out about every place you go that read, "Kilroy has been here." And I was with a young man named Fred Coaches, who was a few years younger than I, who lived in Parma, Idaho. And he got so mad at seeing that sign, "Kilroy had been here," that it really was funny to the rest of us. And I was discharged with a boy by the name of Jim Bailey, who lived just out of town, and another boy by the name of Howard McGinnis, who was raised in Aurora here. And I really felt fortunate that I was on the same ship coming home with them. We all went out to eat on Christmas Day, and we ate at the Olympic Hotel in Seattle, Washington. And we thought we could eat so much, and we found out we couldn't eat very much. I guess your stomach shrinks a little bit when you don't get too much food. But we had a marvelous day that day. And then the next day, I can't remember what day of the week Christmas is on, but the next day after Christmas, we got on a ferry and we went to Bremerton, Washington, where we received our discharge. And that was a very happy event. And then we all came home to Aurora together.